event on the topic, the state of the Middle East, a broader perspective for a resolution of the conflict, or let's say the conflicts, because there are many in the Middle East. My name is Bitte Hammargren. I'm a Swedish journalist, writer, and Middle East analyst. I will be moderating this seminar, which will be live streamed. You will have chances to ask questions at the end of this seminar. And I'm very pleased and honored to have here as my guest Dan Smith, Director of Stockholm Peace International Research Institute, SIPRI. Welcome.
Thank you.
And the occasion for this conversation is also the launch of your book. It's actually the third edition of your book. We can have a look at it. The State of the Middle East Atlas. It's a very useful book, and we'll talk about it a bit later on. But first, I'd like to give a presentation of who you are, actually, in your background. You happen to be by British background, born in Sri Lanka, I understand, and a professor. You have a background at the International Alert in London, which is what?
It's a peace-building NGO that works in about 25, 26 countries and territories around the world. We did policy research and are also actively engaged in trying to help communities and societies build peaceful relations in countries that are threatened by or involved in or trying to recover from violent conflict.
And for many years you were also based in Oslo as the director of
the International Peace Research Institute, Oslo.
Which means that you have a really long time past in Scandinavia, but and I know that you happen to speak Swedish or Norwegian or Scandinavian.
Or a bastardized mixture of the two languages, which rules me out of intelligent communication in either one.
Well, you can pick your language, which you choose here.
Icelandic? No. English will do fine.
We'll try it so. Now, the state of the Middle East as we are now, 5 years after the outburst of the Arab Spring. We know what happened. It's crushed or burned to ashes in many places. And last year we saw more than 40 armed conflicts around the world, many of those in the Middle East. We have now a situation with 60 million displaced persons in the world, many of those in the Middle East. About half of them are internally displaced in their own countries. Half of Syria's population is either refugees within their own country or outside in the world. And we have increasing military expenditure in the world with huge increases in Saudi Arabia, for instance, which is now conducting a war in Yemen. So there is plenty to talk about, and we know, according to estimates, that another 1 million refugees are expected to come to Europe this year. But this occasion for this launch is also, it happens to coincide with the 50th anniversary of SIPRI. I know that you mentioned that SIPRI is like a gift of the Swedish people to the world.
Yeah.
Can you explain?
Well, for 50 years, SIPRI has been turning out the most reliable data on military spending, the arms industry, the arms trade, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological, whole range of work which has been going on, which is, I think, is trusted and is taken seriously. And this was an institute that was set up in 1966 to acknowledge 150 years of Sweden without a war. And it was really started as a way of, it was indeed consciously seen as being a contribution that Sweden could make to well-being in the world. And it remains so. I feel that we could do more than sometimes it seems as if the Institute may have been doing to put ourselves across to the Swedish people. Outside of Sweden, SIPRI has an absolutely solid gold reputation. We put out some material on the arms industry, what we call a data launch, just before Christmas. And there were, 2,000 media outlets took it up around the world and were just quoting citing our material, and that becomes a part of the basis on which it's possible to talk about the condition the world is in. So yes, this is a global public good, which is contributed largely by, well, initially by Swedish creativity, let's say, and largely by Swedish financing through the half century of its life so far.
And I think the Swedish financing constitutes some 70% of the budget?
Probably in total, yes. The core grant is now is less than 50%. And so that's a kind of a block support that is given to SIPRI by vote of the Swedish Parliament. And then there are the standard kind of project grants that one picks up from the Foreign Ministry and from other sources, including overseas, including other governments and the European Commission, UN bodies and so on.
I know that you said when we met recently that SIPRI largely ignored Sweden too long. When you said so, does it mean that you feel that the Swedish funding is at risk?
No, I don't think it is at risk, because I think that there is a strong recognition of the value of what we are doing. But I feel that it is true that the strength of that recognition is a little bit confined to a group that knows us, and that group is too small for my liking. Perhaps it's just because I'm a kind of a communicative kind of person, and I like to talk to and be in dialogue and discussion with as many people and as many groups as possible. But I would like us to be reaching out more within Sweden as well as outside. And that's something which I have sort of set as being a target that we should be aiming at and achieving this year, with meetings like this, also with the Security and Development Forum we will have in April, with a conference on secure cities, which we will have in September. And just in general, I think those will generate a larger presence, a larger visibility for us in Swedish society.
Sounds good. So from now on, you will go public to the Swedish.
And following the advice of my 6-year-old son, I will try harder to learn Swedish. He has told me, he said, you just have to try harder, Daddy. Of course not.
Children are very tough teachers.
Well, I just don't know where he got a thought like that from.
Now, about your book, let's show it again. It describes the Middle East in a historical, thematic, geographic context with lots of diagrams and graphics, and also lots of statistics, but you also underline that statistics alone are not facts, but just a way of representing facts, and that there is always a political choice behind statistics.
Well, first of all, there's always a choice with statistics. I mean, indeed, if you talk to the people at SIPRI who are working on the arms data, you'll find that they are making, in a sense, technical choices about what is the right methodology, what is the reliable sources, what can we rely on. But then beyond that, it's also true that a lot of statistics get very, very politicized. So, for example, in a lot of statistics, statistical coverage of the Middle East, the Palestinians just disappear. Right? Of course, they're there when you talk about figures for refugees and so on, but when you're looking at some of the more economic and social data, it's hard to get your hands on that data for comparability. The Sahrawi people in Western Sahara are absent in the data. When Iraq was under sanctions during the 1990s, Iraq and its people virtually disappeared from international data sets. And so data always have to be treated for several different reasons, but including because of the politics, with a considerable amount of care. It's obviously important to base arguments, positions, policies, recommendations, action on evidence, right? But to just turn to statistics and say, well, the statistics prove that, is in my view a weak basis for an argument.
But if I just pick one piece of statistics that I saw just recently, it said that during the First World War, about 5% of the fatalities, of the casualties, were civilians in those years. But over the decades, the number of civilian casualties has increased to something like 90%.
Yeah, that's one of those statistics that you need to treat with a certain amount of caution, because when that statistic was first produced, which was in about 1991-92, in a study that was done for the Red Cross, the casualties were being counted, not the deaths, and the casualties were including refugees. In other words, it was those people who suffered in war. But a lot of the detail of the sentence got left out, and it became 90% of those killed in war today are civilians. I do think, obviously, that compared to the First World War, which was very much a battle between armies, and armies were killing each other, and navies as well, that today far more civilians are killed. But actually, if you go back to wars before the First World War, and you think about the colonial period, and what the colonizing powers were doing in Africa, you would find that, so to speak, the civilian share in war lethality was much higher. So although this is in lots of ways a brutal period, I'm afraid it's not uniquely brutal.
You say in your book that 6 factors have shaped the modern Middle East. Can you list them shortly?
Sure. Well, the first one obviously is Islam. And I think you cannot take account of the politics or the shape of the Middle East without thinking about Islam. The second one, somewhat more recent, is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is often misunderstood, actually, because at peak it held more territory in Europe than it did in the Middle East and North Africa. But it's a much more influential force in shaping the Middle East as it is today than in many ways it has ended up being in Southeastern Europe. The third force is European colonialism. Hang on, 1, 2, 3. I've got 3 more to go.
US.
The intervention or the role of the US, which started considerably earlier than people think. I mean, in a really sort of powerful way, you would probably date it to the Suez Crisis, 1956, when really the US started to kind of, more than nudge, really solidly elbow Britain and France to one side and say it is our policy which will work from now. But actually, engagement in the affairs of Middle East and North Africa was the first foreign policy action of the independent United States of America, with the so-called Barbary Wars, or the Corsairs, the wars against pirates in North Africa.
Another factor is Israel here.
The foundation of Israel is absolutely essential, even though you could say, it's essential to understanding the Middle East. Even though you could say that the actual influence of Israel on events in the Middle East is very often overrated, the fact that Arab states could not prevent the foundation of Israel, which they set out to do, the fact that they could not then defeat Israel in wars, which they set out to do, the fact that they could not support the PLO effectively enough for the PLO to really beat Israel, all of this is part of a critique of the leadership of the Arab world, which then gets all sort of tied into a narrative that includes its dependence on the West, its corruption, its turning away from the true ways of Islam, and so on. So the story of Israel is absolutely central there. And the sixth factor is oil.
Exactly.
Because oil has done so much to, on the one hand, generate the development or motor the development which has happened in the Middle East, and on the other hand, has been a way in which many Middle Eastern regimes have been able to avoid needing to be truly accountable to their people. They've been able to be rich, and the elites have been able to thrive without needing to tax their people. And when governments need to tax people, there's usually some kind of a relationship of accountability that gets established. I mean, the American War of Independence, those who wanted to be free of English power, famously said, no taxation without representation. But you sometimes think, as a political scientist, you could turn that round and say, well, there's no real representation unless there's taxation as well. And if you can get the resources out of the ground, just extracting them from where we walk, then you don't have that challenge of accountability to the people.
And in those days when, or in these days when there is so much fear about terrorism everywhere, you also underline that the former President Bush's policies, his so-called war on terror, actually produced terrorism.
Yes, I think it's a former Australian Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, whom I first heard say that the only achievement of the war on terror is to produce more of both. And I think that remains pretty much true. Certainly what you can say is that what President Bush and his advisors and his leading allies like UK Prime Minister Tony Blair set out to do in 2001 and above all 2003 with the invasion of Iraq, whatever it was they set out to achieve, it's not what we see today. The same thing can be said about Libya and the decision by Prime Minister Cameron, President Sarkozy, somewhat tepidly backed by President Obama. Whatever it was that they set out to achieve in Libya, it wasn't the situation that you see today. It wasn't to have a country across which 1,800 different armed militias were rampaging to their heart's content. So these policies have not worked, to put it at its kindest.
But how come there was no plan for the day after? No plan seemingly for the day after Saddam Hussein or after Muammar Gaddafi?
I am not the person to ask about that.
I know, you're not.
It's other people who should explain it. What I do know is that the decision not to have what you could call a proper plan for the day after the invasion of Iraq, for the day after Saddam fell, that was a conscious decision. The State Department had been working on post-invasion plans for several months. And I have heard, I've both read, but I've kind of heard from individuals speaking with real pain about the moment when it was agreed that it should be the Pentagon that would be in charge, and people came across from the Department of Defense and they took all of the State Department documentation and they shredded it. And that was about 2 months before the actual movement of forces into Iraq. So it's as if they simply decided, no, it'll be enough just to overthrow Saddam Hussein and everything else will flow after that. I quote in the book a comment by a senior British official made supposedly off the record and therefore leaked for the whole world to be able to read, that the situation in the coalition authority in the first 6 months was total chaos. So the first 6 months after the invasion. So, it is much of what happened afterwards is in some ways inexplicable. It's humanly, ethically inexplicable. But you can understand how one thing led to another when you see what that starting point was.
And many Iraqis who've lived through these different phases, they say that this chaos was deliberately created because the way they considered it was a way to destroy Iraq as a modern state.
I think on that the Bushes would say very much the opposite. I think that the calculation that they made was that if you destroy the Ba'athist Party, which was, it was a one-party state, so if you were working for the government, you were essentially in the Ba'athist Party. So we want to destroy Saddam's state, we want to destroy the Ba'athist Party, and that would give the opportunity then for Iraq to reform, refound itself. And, to be fair, they were ready to invest billions and to deploy tens of thousands of troops over a long period to try to achieve this. I don't think that they set out consciously to destroy Iraq. I just think that the way in which they set out to rebuild Iraq was wrong-headed from beginning to, well, we haven't quite seen the end, but from the beginning it was wrong-headed.
Let's discuss what's in the name the Middle East, the term that we used. It was originally invented by a British military man, I think, with its Eurocentric imperial connotations. But interestingly, many in the Middle East, Arab-speaking people use the same term, Sharq al-Awsat, and in Turkey they say Orta Doğu, meaning the Middle East. So they've sort of imported this Eurocentric term, whereas we do say North Africa about the southern coast of the Mediterranean. It's kind of interesting. Now, many of us tend to say the MENA region, North Africa and the Middle East, but you don't.
No, I mean I'm a little bit lax with nomenclature of all different kinds. So sometimes I'm referring to Middle East and North Africa because that's what people understand. But if I'm thinking of a single region, and I want to give that region the name the Middle East, there's a bit in the introduction where I go into this and show with illustrations the different geographical conceptions of the region. I mean, at one point, the Middle East was really primarily referring to just a very narrow area. Sometimes the term Middle East has been used to go as far east, not only as Iran, which I include, but Pakistan and Afghanistan and even Tajikistan, so that Central Asia, right up to the border of China, becomes the Middle East in a region that then stretches all the way over to Morocco. I mean, in discussions sometimes with people who do Middle Eastern studies, the thing which is the most controversial is that I don't include Turkey in the atlas or in the definition of the Middle East. What I think is that if you think about the Europe of London, Paris, Stockholm, Madrid, then Turkey seems really Middle Eastern, right? But if you think about the Europe of Southeastern Europe, then it seems a lot less different from that. And if you go from Turkey then to the Middle East, you start to see more differences. And I'm not sure, from a data collecting point of view, what's the right region into which to tuck Turkey. But that's not really what I was thinking about with this. What I'm thinking about is, here is a region which is bound together in these ways with this kind of trajectory. Turkey has had a great influence upon that region, but I think it is more sui generis. I see it as being more by itself. Obviously subject to some of the same influences, but also the source of some of those influences on the shape of the region. And with a political and economic and a social trajectory, which is rather different from the Middle East region as a whole.
The Middle East implies diversity by history. It's the birthplace of three religions, and it has had a huge ethnic and religious diversity, but sadly less so than 100 years ago due to genocide, wars, and migration. It has now about 410 million people in the region. Most are Arabs and most are Muslims, but not all Arabs are Muslims and not all Muslims are Sunni. But what do you see, I mean, in the future scenario here? Do you think that the Middle East is going towards less and less diversity, and that we'll have a series of mono-ethnic statelets or states?
Well, I don't think it will go sort of that far systematically, but I do think that there is something of a trend in that direction. I mean, the first big step away from the diversity of the Middle East is with the Jewish migration to Israel in the post-1945 period. Iran is a highly diverse country. I think Farsi, the Persian population, is about 50% of the country. Iraq has started to lose a lot of its diversity, really in the last, this century. And because of the pressure of war and conflict. And I mean, now that has become very visible with the pressure on the Yazidis and so on. But that is the most recent example of pressures which are narrowing down that diversity there. If you go further to the west and you think of Algeria and so on, there's a strong Berber minority there and in neighboring countries, and I think that will remain as well. So there will continue to be that ethnic diversity, and there's going to continue to be religious diversity as between the Sunni and Shia, and then also Judaism and quite significant numbers of Christians still left. But again, for example, Coptic Christians have been, many have been leaving Egypt because of the pressure that they have come under there. Lebanon is actually the demographics have been shifting a lot over the last 70 or 80 years, but nobody dares really ask how much. It's too politically explosive to take a census and find out what the figures are now, because the constitution is based on an estimate of the diversity of the population. And of course, in terms of this diversity, part of it being the difference between Sunni and Shia, in places now that is becoming not religious diversity but polarization of the worst and most violent kind. And you know, with awful violence being done on both sides. One part of the story of the rise of what we now call by various different names, ISIL, ISIS, Islamic State, Daesh, whatever. One part of that story is to do with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was given a terrible kind of set of reversals during the period of the American strategy, which was called the Surge, which is about 2007, around there. And the Surge was never to do, or it was never primarily to do with increasing American troop numbers. The core to the strategy, and it was a quite successful in its own terms strategy, was a coalition between US forces and Baghdad government and traditional Sunni leaders, turning their militias against Al-Qaeda. That surge having kind of had some successes, and you can see it in the figures for deaths each month. That after the surge, the number of deaths each month is declining sharply. It's not what you in Sweden would call normality, but it was getting much closer towards normality than Iraq had known for the previous 4 years. Right? Then the US says, okay, job done. And the Baghdad government says, now's our chance. And they moved in hard and with a lot of pressure onto some of the very Sunni groups which had been supporting the surge. Right? And out of that moment of completely misplaced and sort of sectarianly driven state violence, Al-Qaeda, now rebranded as Islamic State in Iraq, re-strengthens, regroups, gets new recruits. There was they started to use the tactic of the big prison breakout to bring those who had been imprisoned into their forces. And in time, that becomes a force which in 2014 started to really challenge the viability of the Iraqi state. So it was that moment of, where religious diversity becomes religious polarization. And I think that it still has the capacity for enormous peril and enormous danger in the area.
I think we'll come back to the issue on Syria and Iraq later, but before that, just devote some words to the really small minorities who are at risk, the Yazidi, the Shabak, Assyrians, Mandaeans, and so forth. Those who have no big powers supporting them. You're not a policymaker, but still, what kind of advice would you give to governments if they would ask you how to protect them?
The only protection for those small groups is a peaceful environment. So while it is not possible to achieve that peaceful environment, everything else that one can say is a really short-term palliative measure, whether it would be to do with refugees or protected communities or whatever. And you don't give this as advice, but you really understand why members of those communities are melting away and are rejoining their fellow community members in other countries as best they can. It is for sure, it is a really tough option for them to take. But yes, they have been under enormous pressure, and I think the Yazidis particularly visibly, but by no means alone.
To understand the fabric of the Middle East, one has to see that this is a region with an extremely young population. One used to say that about 50 up to 65% of the population are up to 25 years old. Sweden has a completely different demographic diagram. And it's also a region with extremely rapid urbanization. And these factors, the young urban poor, have been also a force behind the Arab Spring. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Tunisian change, the popular mobilization, was sparked by a young man street trader, though well educated, and the frustration sparked by his despair at the frustrations he faced in the treatment that he was given by the Tunisian police. That was an individual acting, but it was exactly that demographic that you're referring to who mobilized first, and that's also the demographic that mobilized first in Egypt with Tahrir Square. And again, that was sparked by particular police actions. And in many ways, the energy of that mobilization in Egypt was kept going by a kind of a cycle of police action and then the remobilization of that younger demographic. And there, of course, in the case of Egypt and thereafter, and in other places, including Iran at an earlier point, the role of social media, which is seen as being a kind of a youngish person's instrument to be using, that started to become very visible, that this was the way in which information was being passed and mobilization was occurring. In Syria, you can put your finger even more directly onto it, because before the Syrian civil war started, there was about 4 years of really very serious drought. And a large number of people had to leave the land in Syria, to leave their farms behind, and were moving into the peripheries of the cities. So they were, you could almost say, artificially accelerating the ordinary process of urbanization that would have been going on anyway. And it seems as if the authorities were simply unable or ill-equipped to be handling this influx of people into the cities. And that's partly where the energy for the initial mobilizations came in early part of March or so of 2011. So urbanization and that younger demographic, that's very much a part of the story. Again, if you go to the Gulf states, those where they're in Bahrain and in the other Gulf states where there was that mobilization, again you see predominantly there's some degree of youthful frustration with the ruling system is going on.
And now when this young urban poor asking for a different social contract, asking for political freedoms, asking for a fight against corruption, asking for transparency, when they don't get it, but when they are met with the repressive methods instead, should we then be surprised that there is a surge of extremism in the region?
Well, I think first of all, I think we probably shouldn't, because historical experience from many places says that that will often be the result. But secondly, I think that the tale or the narrative of jihadism, the way to explain it, is more than, it has much deeper roots than simply as a response of frustrated young, often not so much the young urban poor as the young urban middle class with well-educated and with very few opportunities in front of them. It's more than just their reaction to the response they face from the authorities. You need to go back into Egypt in the 1960s and Saudi Arabia in the 1970s to see these different strands developing with common themes. For example, one part of the response in some Arab and Islamic circles to the 1967 war, to the humiliation of being utterly defeated in just 6 days. One part of that response was to say, well, look, Israel is a religious state. We in the Muslim world, we have lost our religious clarity and purity. We need to return to being a more genuinely, in some sense of the word, Islamic, in some sense of the word, state, in order to be able to win this. So it ties together this anger at the corruption, anger at the secularism, anger at Western modernization, anger at lack of opportunity, anger at Israel, anger at the US, anger at one hell of a lot of things if you really sit back and think about it calmly. And by about the mid-1980s, you started to get these different strands from Egypt and Saudi Arabia meeting, literally, physically meeting in Peshawar on the border, on the Pakistani border of Afghanistan, as they mobilize for the jihad to drive the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, where, of course, at that point, they're heroes for the West. They're undermining the Soviet Union. It's all to the good. This is Charlie what's-his-name's war, supporting the Mujahideen of Afghanistan. And that's where Osama bin Laden first encountered violent conflict, first encountered armed conflict, first took part in it, started to mobilize support. That's where the base was formed, which became Al-Qaeda. So it's a long story which goes on. By the time, some 23, 24 years after Al-Qaeda was really formed, and you have the Arab Spring going, what you now have is a system, quite sophisticated, quite well developed, of communication, of mobilization, networks of grievance that have achieved major strikes against the West of different kinds, which have achieved major strikes against Western and other forces within the region. And that starts to provide a pole of attraction for what it has to be said is a very, very small minority of predominantly young, predominantly Muslim, mostly men, to attach themselves to. But it doesn't take very significant percentages of people to add up to something that's really quite significant in terms of its capacity to do violence.
But as you mentioned, the unsolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been fueling extremism in the region.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
But you also mentioned Israel and within its 67 borders, and Tunisia as the two examples of democracies in the region. But both have flaws. I mean, Tunisia is a young democracy, huge unemployment, recruitment of jihadists and so forth, torture going on. And Israel is an occupier on the West Bank and controlling, the air and sea space of Gaza. And occupation is supposed to be a temporary thing, and yet this has nearly been going on for 50 years. We have an interesting case now, both with the Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, who has been heavily criticized by Netanyahu's government for talking about investigation of possible killings. But we also have a case of the new US ambassador to Israel, who has been talking about two sets of laws on the occupied West Bank, one for the Israelis and one for the Palestinians. And again, the Netanyahu's government comes out lashing against the US. What does this say? Would you say that the US government is now being more vocal in its criticism about the occupation policies, or does this show an increasing frustration in the world community about this unsolved situation?
Yes, I think it's a little bit hard to read what the real meaning of it is, and I think that looking around, I see some people in this room who would have much more sort of clear ideas and better channels of communication for understanding it. From where I sit, I go back to the end of August or beginning of September 2001, just 10, 12 days before 9/11, when the then relatively new President Bush announced that it was time, in the US administration's view, to stop increasing the settlements. Right? Now is the time to put a stop to that so that we can get a breather and get a proper agreement. And he was asked, well, what will you do if Israel doesn't pay any attention? And I just remember him because it was a very Bushist expression. He said, I expect them to heed the call. They've heard the call. I expect them to heed the call. Shortly thereafter, on the 11th of September, planes crashed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and the response to that began to change many, many things to do not just with the region's politics, but with global politics as a whole. And in the course of that call was lost, because now it was the war on terror. And if you could show that somebody was a terrorist, then they were by definition on the other side. Actually, Putin did that in Russia. He said in Chechnya we're dealing with terrorists as well. Everybody was lining up to say, well, you know, we've got some terrorists, so we're with you, and the ones whom we hate, they're on the other side. And I think at the same time that there is a recognition. When Tony Blair was attempting to, you know, making the diplomatic efforts to get support for the coalition for the move into Iraq in 2003, one of the places he went to was Damascus, and he met with President Assad, and it was sort of fairly reasonable. After all, Syria had been in the US-led coalition in the first Gulf War in 1991. Would it be now? And Assad made it very, very clear to Blair, both in private and in public, that the road to Baghdad leads through Jerusalem. In other words, if you want a coalition to change things in Iraq, listen to what we in the Arab world are saying about the situation on the West Bank. And I think that there is actually a considerable amount of consciousness of some kind. You won't get Western European governments, or indeed the US government, coming out and saying something in those terms. But they understand that there is a germ of that, which indeed is true. If you wish for a stable Arab coalition for peace and justice and democracy in the Middle East, then you should see that that applies consistently, and that has got to therefore include the question of Israel and the occupied territories. And so I think that what we're hearing now is a kind of, you know, an example of the intermittent return to the frustration with Israel that the problem goes on and on. One part of the difficulty, I think, is that the return is intermittent rather than consistently followed policy position.
But if we look at the facts on the ground, and the West Bank really is a patchwork. It doesn't show really on this map, but you have different judicial systems, area A, B, and C, with Israeli jurisdiction on most of the territory and so forth, and 600,000 settlers, including East Jerusalem. Now, given these facts, is the idea of a two-state solution viable? Or should we talk about, from the realities, maybe of a binational state?
Yes, I think it is. I wouldn't like to say that the two-state solution is completely non-viable, but I think it is hard to look at the map of the West Bank. Do we have it up there? No, it's a map in the Atlas. I recommend you all to buy the Atlas. You know, it really is it's a damn good book. And it's got this fabulous map in it, which is called the West Bank.
I love the maps in the book, really.
It's called the West Bank Archipelago. And it shows how the West Bank is sliced and diced by roads and by settlements. And if you look at that map, it is hard to think that there is a viable state there unless those roads were undone and those settlements moved and so on. So, I mean, I am not surprised then that there are Palestinians who are starting, you know, to say, well, you know, no, perhaps we don't want to agree on a two-state solution if the state that we will have is this, you know, essentially ungovernable patchwork. Perhaps we should think of a binational state, and you know, and see how that goes. I think that I honestly am absolutely convinced. I'm a perpetual optimist. I always look on the bright side of absolutely everything. I am unable to see what the solution as between Israel and Palestine is that would give peace and justice to everybody. I think it is a really desperately tragic situation.
But talking about maybe some bright sides in the Middle East right now, we have now the agreement with Iran, which is a success for diplomacy. Most people in the world would agree to. And it will also lead eventually to Iran coming in from the cold in world economy. And most countries are welcoming that, but we have a few exceptions, the Saudis and Netanyahu's government.
And the Republicans in the
And the
Senate.
Republicans. So could anything stop this process, the next US elections?
Yeah, who wants to gaze into the crystal ball of American elections and say what will happen? I think it would be very difficult to row back now. And I think that that is one reason why there was such a big American diplomatic effort to get the agreement done. And I mean, Secretary of State Kerry committed himself personally enormously to it. And the successive high representatives of the EU, Cathy Ashton and then Federica Mogherini, also had. And this was an area of cooperation with Russia which was kept going even while everything else in West-Russia relations was deteriorating. So I think that there is, kind of an enormous commitment into this, which will sustain it. But I do think that of the three sources of resistance to it that you mentioned, I do think that the Saudi source is the one about which I, would have the greatest concerns, the most kind of pressing questions that I wanted to ask.
And you're thinking about Yemen and Syria.
Yes. Well, Saudi Arabia has moved to a very different policy in the last couple of years. I think if you look at Saudi armed forces 25 years ago, you could say, that, well, these are just vanity projects, buying all of these weapons and this modern air force and so on. You wouldn't say that now. Not now it's being used. Right? They're building a northern security barrier of extraordinary dimensions on the border with Iraq. They've got a southern security barrier of less impressive dimensions, but nonetheless for real on the border with Yemen. They've been deploying armed force around the region, their area. They've become more and more assertive. At the same time, there is a large Shia minority in Saudi Arabia whose main area where they live happens to be the oil richest area of Saudi Arabia as well. So the Saudi government has always been very sensitive about that community and what it might get up to and so on. So they've gone from a quite cautious status quo view of the region, one in which they were willing to make an awful lot of compromises in order that kind of, business could be done and things could move forward in a relatively calm way, to being a government that at the moment seems willing to take quite extraordinary risks. And I guess that that's the question mark.
Yes.
That you then wonder about the relation with Iran. But I do think that even there, they must see that there is less than little to be gained by really pressing in an active, hard military way against Iran. And there is a big difference between making declaratory statements of undying opposition and actually really going out and doing something about it with force. And I just pray and hope that the Saudi rulers will recognize that difference and not cross the line.
But we also know that there are differences within the House of Saud right now, and that the rulers at the time are being questioned by other important princes.
Seemingly so, and that there seems to be more dissension within this very complex ruling family than there has been at any time before.
Let's move on to a very pressing issue, Syria. Bleeding, it's a human tragedy in tremendous dimensions, and also a battleground for so many other forces than the Syrians, the regional big powers, Russia and the US to some extent. Now the peace talks are supposed to start next week on the 25th. What are the prospects for this?
The prospects for achieving an agreement that brings an end to the war in Syria?
No, for the peace talks starting.
That's what I was going to say. I think that if the peace talks manage to go ahead, if they can find something that is beyond just nice expressions to come up with at the end, if they can see some kind of a political path ahead, which is, persuasive to a significant number of actors in this war theatre, then I think that will be an achievement. What I worry about is that those who are on the ground and who are really, carrying out the actions that create the conditions you were just talking about, that if they feel that the talks are just merest blah, then that's what the talks will be. That doesn't mean to say that the effort to hold the talks is a waste of time. I think that diplomacy often includes this of sort of, diplomats get, I think the reason why diplomats are very often very calm types is because they bang their heads against so many brick walls so much that a calm reaction is the only one they're capable of anymore. And I say that knowing
we
that
have a few diplomats in the room
there's a
here.
number of ambassadors in the room. And
Yes.
no, but I think, a lot of diplomacy is at the time thankless, and one journalist or another can write a very good article with a headline which shows that something terrible is happening because this government or that government is talking to an absolutely unacceptable group or government, and and this is a scandal. The truth is that you will only get a settlement in Syria if there is agreement by those who are now fighting, and you will not get agreement unless they sit at a table. This is the lesson that had to be learned, the British learned about the IRA. We had to shift away from the language that said it is absolutely impossible to have any communication with these people whatsoever. You have to grasp the nettle at some point of talking. First of all, in the case of Syria, you tried to have peace talks without Assad. Right? I mean, that's crazy. What are you doing? You can have talks, you can have an interesting discussion, but you can't have a peace negotiation without having the other players there. Those who are doing something in the area, for good or bad, have got to be involved. Now, whether it is possible, as some are hoping, that there could be a genuine anti-ISIS coalition created out of this, or what the results would be of a genuine anti-ISIS coalition. I mean, I think that has... I am concerned that this has still not been thought through properly as to what the meaning of such a coalition would be.
And the fact that the Saudis have now broken their diplomatic relations with Iran at this important moment will affect the climate.
Yeah, yes, it is bound to. They're supporting opposing sides in the conflict. They have been from the beginning. Both of them need to be engaged, but there are different ways to be engaged in negotiations. When I say they need to be at the table, I'm speaking loosely. There are also informal and back-channel ways of being engaged in a peace process or peace negotiation that mean that the lack of a formal relationship between the two countries isn't necessarily fatal.
Trying to read between the lines of what you were saying about having a solution without or peace talks without talking to Assad, does it mean that you think that the West got too deeply involved with the Syrian opposition, or miscalculated, or the forces on the ground?
No, I don't think they got too deeply involved, and I'm sure that the Syrian opposition would say they didn't get deeply involved enough. But I think that there was something there where there started to be a quite simplified view that saw Assad as essentially being another Ben Ali or another Mubarak, that he would go. That if there was enough pressure, then he would go. And if he didn't go, then that was his fault, so you just needed to increase the pressure. And didn't understand that Assad was different. Assad and the ruling system in Syria was differently rooted in Syria than Mubarak's government was in Egypt, and Tunisia again was a quite different situation. So it was kind of a tide of optimism. We're on a roll here. One's gone, two gone. Gaddafi, number 4 at Syria. Oh, it didn't work there. Well, it didn't work because Syria was a very different, or is a very different kind of country from the other three.
But the tactics of the Assad regime is always to say, we don't have an opposition, we're not fighting an opposition, we're just fighting terrorists. And this is also what Russia is trying to say. But yes, there is an opposition which is really suffering under the barrel bombs and sieges and so forth.
There is a genuine opposition, there is a democratic opposition, there's a movement there that ought to be allowed to express itself and ought to have been allowed to express itself. But the relationship between the democratic opposition and some of those forces that allied with it in the Syrian National Coalition is more complex than one might think at first. Many of those forces that allied with it have broken from it and then come back to it. They've been quite opportunistic. They were anti-Assad rather than pro-democratic. And I think that that's also been part of the difficulty in the situation.
Let's move over, before we leave the floor for questions, to the issue of how to fight ISIS efficiently. I mean, we've had bomb campaigns for a year now, but they're still there. They're holding territory. What would be the more efficient way to curb them?
I mean, I think that where Western policy has got us to is a very difficult situation, where it's hard to pull back and it's dangerous to go forward, and standing still is simply not an option either. So it's a set of real dilemmas around what to do. So I think nobody should think that there is an easy solution. Personally, I think that the increase in the bombing campaign that came in the latter part of last year, I understand it emotionally, psychological reaction to the events in Paris, but as a rational, strategic action, no, I don't think it's viable. There was a report that came out at least I saw it in British newspapers at the very end of the year, that after all the fuss and the noise in Britain about taking the decision to stand firm with our French allies and bomb ISIS in Syria, that a total of 3 bombing raids had been carried out in the first month of deploying the Royal Air Force into that operation. There's not the targets to bomb. They're not that easy to acquire and find. There's all kinds of difficulties now as well with the Russians also occupying the airspace. I guess there is some kind of informal agreement where they manage not to trip over each other, because if it weren't for that, we would have many more situations like when the Turkish fighter shot down the Russian plane. So I don't think that thinking you can pile on the military pressure from the air is going to work. There are those, and I respect the opinion, who say it must be a military and political solution combined. So you have to have the armed option, but, in the view of some, then it's got to include troops on the ground, which I think no European capital, and also nor in Washington, is anybody going to go for.
They have to be local.
They have to be local. So this is why in the debate in the House of Commons, David Cameron came up with a figure of 70,000 anti-ISIS forces whom we could be supporting and fighting with. But the background briefings gave no confidence about that figure whatsoever. So the military option seems to me to be clearly limited. Rather, let me put it this way. The military option which Western governments seem willing to utilize is clearly of limited effect. The one that might be of more serious effect, they seem unwilling to go for. So then you move towards the political and the financial measures. Everything that can be done to restrict financing support for ISIS needs to be done. That includes hitting the oil trade, and it includes hitting the flow of funds into Syria. That must also include then cooperation on the Turkish-Syria border to that end. I think you've also got to look longer term at the recruitment cycle. But as I said, it's a very tiny minority of people who are really drawn to ISIS.
Are we sort of overestimating their impact because we give them so much attention in our media?
I don't think so. I've thought about that quite a lot. I mean, in terms of the impact of the Paris attack, I mean, it's for real. And if people feel differently about the city in which they live, that is hardly surprising. But the numbers are really quite small. I mean, the UK figures are that 800 have gone to Syria from Britain, of whom 400 have come back, and 600 have been prevented. Across the whole of Europe, it's some thousands who are thought to have gone, of whom many have come back. These are very, very small proportions of the total. And trying to guard against that in the way that is now being discussed is leading sometimes to perfectly surreal situations. I don't know if you saw this story in today's papers in Britain. A kid, a 10-year-old, was interviewed. He'd written in a paper in school, writing an essay. I live in a terrorist house. He was misunderstanding, mishearing, and misspelling the word terraced, which means, a row of houses connected to each other. So he wanted to write, I live in a terraced house. And instead he wrote, I live in a terrorist house. The law says the teachers must report that.
Oh.
That's what the law says. Right? So the teacher was not reacting disproportionately. I mean, yes, sure, actually, probably a sensible teacher would have said, come here and learn how to write the word properly. But in fact, it was reported, and the police went and called on the family, and to find out about this terrorist house. So I just don't think it works, and it doesn't work for the kind of society that we want to have, that we want to live in. I don't see that it's a successful way of preventing ISIS if we turn ourselves inside out and upside down in the name of a war on ISIS. But nonetheless, something needs to be done that restricts this flow of people to Syria and away, because we have seen that they are capable of inflicting an awful lot of misery both within Syria and then at home when they come back. And I think that, I think a huge or much bigger effort can be made to take down to take down ISIS on social media. There could be much more done to prevent that from happening.
Last summer, Tony Blair's former advisor, Jonathan Powell, was in Sweden, in Almedalen, talking about his book, Talking to Terrorists. And this is his line of thought, that you have to do it ultimately because they're there. And of course, there is silent diplomacy in many cases. Do you think that there is such silent diplomacy going on, talking to ISIS?
I would not be at all surprised. There was with Hamas and Hezbollah at times when the language about both those organizations was as extreme as we now hear about ISIS, thinking about them in the same terms. And I know for sure, because I talked to people who were doing it, that there were contacts being had. I would imagine that, yes, indeed, there are contacts with ISIS from different sources and through different governments, because governments and government agencies and probably ISIS like to keep options open. And you only keep options open if you keep doors open ajar so that you can communicate and you can see what's on the other side. So I don't know for a fact, but I would not be at all surprised to find out.
Interesting. Now, I think it's time for questions. What do you say? We have a microphone, or we might have two microphones. We'd like to ask you to keep questions short and questions really to Dan Smith. Let's take two at a row. And please state your name.
Good afternoon, or good evening more. Fatma Omrani, I'm the ambassador for Tunisia. And to follow up on the last discussion on ISIL, how do you see the interaction with what is happening in North Africa? Some are saying, and some analysts are saying, that we are just moving a problem to another part of the world. How is your thought about that?
You want to answer it directly?
Well, if you want to take two.
Let's take one more question.
Thank you. Dan, thank you for your presentation. I'm Nabil Al-Dakil, Ambassador of Kuwait. I do have a couple of points that I would like to raise with you, if I may. The first one is not very much has been talked about this afternoon with regards to Iran and the lifting of the sanctions, which have happened at the beginning of this year, not long ago. How do you see the policy, and if any change, if the lifting of the sanctions will have any impact on changes of the issues regarding the Middle East? The other issue is also, we also have the presidential elections in the US next year, as well as in Russia. So how do you see that playing a role on the events in the Middle East? Last thing I'd like to say, a lot of people speak about ISIS, and when you say ISIS, everybody thinks of Islam, unfortunately. I have started, not to say petition, but I have spoken to my colleagues in the Arab group here in Stockholm, And I thought we should start calling it NISIS and not ISIS. And N would stand for non-Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Because very honestly, these people do not represent Islam.
No.
As a Muslim, I myself, my country is as well, very much touched by and affected by ISIS. In June, we had the explosion in front of the mosques. And same thing happened in Tunisia, it happened in Paris, it happened in Egypt, it happened in many cities around the world. So I'd like to hear your point of view on this, and I hope you agree with me to help me with, start this NISIS thing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think NISIS is, NISIS is nice. I mean, it's, I think the raising that issue, what it does get to this point, that they do not, the jihadis do not represent Islam. But at the same time, I think it is important, and it's probably more important for people like me than it is for people like you. That's to say, people like me from the West who are not Islamic, who are looking at the region as outsiders rather than people like you who come from it. It's very important for us to understand as calmly as we possibly can that many of these people do feel either a religious motivation or a religious explanation or a religious justification for what they're doing. However misguided and misled that may be, there is something that is for them true in their psychology and their emotions, and that leads them in that direction. What we mustn't let happen with that is that then leads into generalizations about Islam as such, right? Which, as you well know, it's very easy to trigger in a discussion in Western Europe or in the US. But without getting to that kind of, the unhelpful, the actually destructive kind of generalization, to understand that there is a component of faith and belief that stretches beyond the rational and beyond the reach of a purely rational argument. That, I think, it's important there. But I do agree with you that raising the issue of the name is important. And I guess that's why there has been so much, why even they have also changed their name. The naming of things is important. I've got a whole pile of things to go through there, and I will try not to get lost in it. The Russian presidential election, I think that whatever the result of the Russian presidential election is, it will not have an effect on Russian policy, on actions in the area. The US presidential election is potentially extremely important. And as I said earlier, I am not going to get into crystal ball gazing. I'm not going to try. I just refuse to try and imagine a world in which Donald Trump is the president. If we have to face that, then we have to face that. But we'll wait until November, and maybe the answer will, if we're lucky, the answer will come much sooner. The question of sanctions, which you raised, Iranian sanctions, I think it is enormously important that the sanctions, the implementation day deadline was reached just about. I think the announcement was made 8 hours or something after it was supposed to have been. But nonetheless it got made. Nonetheless that's gone ahead. You could see from the way in which the tankers immediately started to move, investment immediately started to move. This was a well-prepared moment. And if Iran can take some kind of what you could call normal place in the region, then I think that is to the good. And I think that will be beneficial to the people of Iran, and it will also be, it's a win-win if this all works properly. The question that you asked, Madam Ambassador, about ISIS, ISIL, and NISIS, and Tunisia. First of all, Tunisia, although it is the sort of the one flower from the spring that still flourishes, right, is also disproportionately a large provider of recruits for ISIS and other forces, other groups in Syria. And that, I think, reflects an issue. The organization I was previously with, International Alert, did some research in the suburbs of Tunisia about attitudes of young people there. And there's a great deal of alienation, a great deal of feeling of lack of being respected, lack of opportunity, lack of respect. And while those who were answering in the research were not saying, therefore I support the jihadis, they were saying, therefore I can sympathize with some people who might wrong-headedly feel that the jihadis. So I think that there is something there about what the economic and social future is for the North African countries. If one thing which you haven't asked, and I'm very glad that you haven't, is that I should look into another crystal ball and say, where is the most serious risk now of something happening? I don't know how serious the risk is in terms of probability, but I think that if the Tunisian democracy were to be derailed, and if there were also to be an upsurge of violence in Algeria, that these two things would be tragic and of vast, almost unimaginably big consequences for the region, including across the northern side of the Mediterranean. I therefore think it's really important that it's hard enough, while it's hard enough to think, what should our approach to ISIS be now? We should also remember that in 2011, America got its biggest success in the war on terror. It killed the leader of the organization that had organized the 9/11 attacks on New York. And out of Al-Qaeda came what? So if there is success against ISIS, seen in some light, that you could say, mission accomplished, then out of the wreckage of ISIS will come what? And unless we are able to deal with the roots and the sources of all of this, then we live with a perpetual problem.
I know we have a question here.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm Bakr Fattah, Ambassador of Iraq. First, before my questions, I would like to mention about that youth. Talk about the day after Saddam Hussein, that the United States, they are not planning for the day after Saddam Hussein. But I see that it was a very big mistake by the United States after the collapse of the regime of Iraq, because misunderstanding of the Iraqi society, misunderstanding of the alternative of the Iraqi government. They appointed the governor of Iraq, Bremer, as a governor of Iraq. That was a very big mistake. And after Saddam, we had alternative of the government, but because they are very easy reach Iraq and get Baghdad, so they didn't see about anything. They marginated all the oppositions of Iraq, and they did by themselves. It was very mistake, and I'm not going to explain other mistakes which take place after that. But I would like to ask you that you mentioned that there is a lot of factor contributed in the shaping of Middle East. My question, is there any possibility, because most of these factors it was changed now, is there any possibility for reshaping Middle East?
For reshaping the Middle East. Well, first of all, just to comment on Iraq and mistakes, I think it's always worth remembering that former US Secretary of State and indeed National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, when being questioned, doing a Q&A after a lecture one time, said, I'm sure we made thousands of mistakes in Iraq. And later on, her office issued a clarification saying she didn't mean it literally, but, maybe. I think the understanding that there were just, enormous mistakes made at the time, I think that's very, very widespread now. And unfortunately and sadly, Iraq still carries and will carry for some time the consequences of those errors. I think that in a way, the Arab Spring was a sign of a possibility of reshaping, reforming, redefining the Middle East. Not as it was done in terms of boundaries by the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a British politician and a French diplomat sitting back and over a port and cigar, kind of, drawing some straight lines on a map and saying this is how it will be. We'll have Lebanon, you can have Syria, we'll have southern Iraq. Who cares about the rest of it, and so on. But a reshaping of its politics. And there's two things that I say in the atlas, not in pictures of any kind, but just in words. One, right at the beginning, is I use the expression that hope has taken a short break. Those factors which created the Arab Spring have not gone away. And all other things being equal, they will return. And when hope has completed taking its short break, then there will be renewed pressure for further democratic change. And that's part of the reason why I think it's so important at the moment to try to protect as many of those changes that have been made which persist, or as many places that have not tipped over into disaster as possible. And those must be, or should be, at the forefront of policy. The second thing I say at the end, it's the closing image in the text of the atlas. In 1979, forerunners of today's jihadis took over the Great Mosque in Mecca. And after a siege in which hundreds of people were killed, some 60 plus of the militants were arrested and imprisoned, and then they were sentenced to death. And they were executed in public in a number of cities all around Saudi Arabia. And this was to make a clear demonstration of the power and of the punishment. And I forget in which town it was now, but in one of them, the first of the jihadis to be led out into the square with the people standing around to be executed by decapitation, came out shouting curses against the authorities. And then he knelt and he put his head on the block. And the executioner's sword came up, and as it began to come down, he raised his neck to get there quicker. Right? Now that's one image to hold in your mind. The other one is in the beach massacre in Tunisia in the middle of last year, when waiters in the hotel formed a human barrier to say, you are not one of us. You go now. And they protected some of the holidaymakers. And there was a lone builder on a building site who saw this guy running, and he had roof tiles in his hand. He picked them up and he threw them at the guy, and hit him a couple of times and slowed him down, and he was arrested. Now, on the one hand, in both violent context, but on the one hand, you have an impulse which is self-sacrificial and violent and murderous. Right? And that's the image from 1979. And on the other hand, you have one of waiters who are effectively the servants of the hotel guests, but they put their lives on their line. And that is also, that's a fundamental kind of human instinct to do that. Now, which of those two images wins out in the future of the Middle East is what defines whether the reshaping of the Middle East is along a democratic line that promotes human security increasingly, respect for each other's dignity and so on, or whether we continue on the path that we seem to be on at the moment. There I am optimistic. There I do think we will come off that path.
That actually sounds like a closing note, but I know we have one more question here. Okay, two, three. Okay, three. And then
Thank you very much for Mrs. Smith for a wonderful conversation. It was really interesting, Ambassador for Armenia. I would like to ask about two issues which you mentioned. I don't think even you mentioned it briefly. I mean, the first one is, of course, about Kurdish issue, which is one of the very dynamic ethnicities and with aspirations to have their own institutions in the region. And then I would like also to ask about economy, viability of the economy of the region. I mean, is it sustainable for prolonged conflict, or it is because we have also alterations
that's a
there.
long one.
Iran in, oil is out. So, Thank you.
Thank you. And so, second question, Ambassador Hala.
Thank you, Ambassador of Palestine. Thank you, first of all, for this most interesting presentation. I was, out of all of this, a sentence keeps running into my head, which is that history binds us all together. And in that sense, we need, when we talk about Daesh or ISIS or NISIS, we need to also think, why are young men and women going from Europe to the Middle East or to Syria and Iraq? This is one thing. And also regarding Palestine, I think that also when we think about history, I have to say that in 1968, we suggested and we proposed a secular democratic state to resolve the conflict in Palestine, and yet it was rejected first and foremost by Western Europe and also by Israel. And it's we Palestinians, we cannot even take a break from hope. We need to be hopeful and we need to continue to work for our independence and this end of occupation. I don't know whether you believe that the binational state works. I personally don't think that two wrongs make a right. And also because even for Palestinians who are now around 2 million, they are Israeli citizens. There are at least 50 laws that discriminate against them, and it's, you know, the laws governing the relations between the occupiers and the people under occupation, which is us in the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, are really apartheid regime. So what are your thoughts on that? And thank you, sorry for taking too long.
And the last question here.
Thank you. I would like to present myself. I am the Chargé d'Affaires of the Syrian Embassy here in Stockholm. Being the last speaker, I will be very brief. You have already mentioned that what's happening in Syria is civil war. And according to you know, all UN terms, they have never used the civil war, as you know. And the civil war cannot be when 85 nationalities, they are fighting on the Syrian ground. You know, one of those nationalities, they are Swedish, who were sentenced, you know, about 10 days ago for life imprisonment, because they had beheaded a Syrian citizen. It cannot be a civil war when you have John, you know, the beheader from United Kingdom. So, you know, I would like to, this is question number one. Another brief question. You know that His Excellency President Bashar Assad, he was elected in June 2014 by, you know, we invited people from all around the world to see these elections, and we did it here in Stockholm as well. And all envoyees of the United Nations, when they go to Syria, they meet with him, and they always, you know, say that President Assad is pushing for political solution. And another last remark. Of course, I wish, you know, to speak more, but to be very brief. The other thing, you had touched on opposition. You know, how could, you know, have opposition who is killing people, you know, shelling Damascus and Homs and Latakia every day with mortars? Do you consider ISIS or Nusra as opposition in Syria? Because this is what the Syrian army is fighting. We are fighting and combating terrorism to eliminate it from our country. And as you have mentioned, you know, the opposition that we will see in Geneva, most of them, they were Syrian officials. Thank you.
Okay.
So you know what kind of opposition is this?
I'm not sure how far actually to rise to the bait that you're dangling there. But let me say that amongst the opposition that the government of Syria is fighting is those civilians who are still trying to live an ordinary life and who are killed by barrel bombs. So in Aleppo, for example. So let's not mess around with this. There is a war going on. Yes, it started as a civil war. Now it is largely internationalized. You're right. There is a sense in which Syria has become, and this is part of the tragedy, it's become the arena in which, into which a lot of fighters come in order to, fight. Not.
Say that I am here as a political asylum refugee because of her chemical Assad. I am here. I'm asking asylum here because of her.
Okay. I
Okay.
think we should
I
leave
th- I
the floor to
think- yeah.
Dan Smith now for you to answer.
And, you know, of course it is also true, as you say, that President Assad has stated clearly that he wants a political solution. I think that every person actually wants a political solution. The question is the terms of that solution. And the election in the middle of 2014 doesn't mean anything in this kind of light. There is, as you have pointed out, a really complex, difficult war going on. Half of Syria's population is displaced. Some 40% of that displacement is outside of the country and the rest within the country. Unemployment is huge. The situation is really desperate. We need to have talks and we need to have a political solution that must be agreed by all sides. I will leave it there for the moment, but I just want to be clear that whatever the language and the rhetoric which is used, the awful violence is being done. And it is not only ISIS in Syria that has done violence, obviously. I come to the question that you raised, sir, about Kurds and also the economy. And I'll try to be as brief as I possibly can with this, and then I'll come to the question of Israel-Palestine again. On the Kurds, what I say in the Atlas, this reflects the best understanding that I have, is that the Kurdistan that was briefly promised at the end of the First World War is not going to happen. Right? Nonetheless, Kurds in Iraq could feel that especially Kurdish political leaders in Iraq could feel that their situation is better now than it was before 2003. And they could see themselves as being beneficiaries of the 2003 invasion and the overthrow of Saddam. I think it's the year before last now, isn't it, in 2014, that there started to be serious discussion again about the Kurdish area of Iraq becoming autonomous and independent. And if the Baghdad government were to stay for a long time in the condition that it was in the second half of 2014, I think it might be impossible for any outsider to prevent that autonomy becoming a real independence in the course of time. But I don't think that united Kurdistan, covering Turkey and Syria, Iraq and parts of Iran, is ever going to happen. On the economy, the thing which everybody comments about to do with economics in the region, and quite rightly, is the dependence upon oil, and is the relatively limited development that has happened. It's not zero, but relatively limited apart from what's been motored by oil. The real difficulty, which very few people comment on, is that for far too much, trading relations, the major trading relations of the states of the region, are not with each other. They're outside the region. And until you get those much stronger economic relations established within the region, trading within the Gulf area, trading from the Gulf to the Maghreb and so on, until that becomes much, much stronger than it is at the moment, and a much greater volume of economic activity is carried on in that way, the Middle East will always be hyper vulnerable to the international global trends, and you can see that now with the price of oil. So I think proper economic development for the region requires much more regional integration and getting outside of the dependence on oil. Those would be the two things. Neither of them easy. Right. One state, two states, arguably more. Everything depends on the terms within that. Right? So can I envisage a two-state solution, which for a long time has been the most popular? I mean, if you did opinion polls in both Israel and the West Bank and Gaza separately over the years from about 2000 to 2010-12, you tended to find majorities for a two-state solution. The difficulty was not agreeing the destination. The difficulty was agreeing how to get there. But can I envisage that two-state agreement being fair, that it includes respect for human rights and human dignity? Yes, I can. Could I envisage a single-state solution doing the same things? Yes, I can do. In the abstract, I can. The question is, what are the real political prospects of that? In 1990, or let's go back a couple of years before that, say in 1985, at a time when in black townships in South Africa, necklacing was not common, but it was happening. You remember necklacing? Mm-hmm. Hanging tires, burning tires around people? Could you then have thought of a South African cricket team that includes Hashim Amla, one of the best batsmen in the world, includes a black fast bowler? I mean, could you conceive of a black president of South Africa? Could you conceive of the peaceful arrangement being made, the transition from apartheid to what still, for technical reasons, has to be referred to as a transitional democracy, but nonetheless one in which citizens take an equal part? Incredibly difficult to think about that in 1985, and yet it came about. So big transformations are possible despite everything. I would say that at the moment, Israel and Palestine would need to be negotiating less ambitious agreements than either a two-state solution or a single-state solution. In other words, the interim steps. The problem is that people like me have been saying that for the past 20 years, and look where you have got to. At some point, maybe, the big leap will be taken. And what has to be understood there, to go back to your other point, is the complex ways in which history connects us. Israel is a state now with nearly 70 years of history. Like it, loathe it, or just feel neutral about it, that is a fact. That is right there. The Palestinian people have been living in that area and are living now. Like it, loathe it, or just feel neutral, that is a fact. Those facts have got to be a part of the solution which is made. Israel will have to change dramatically. The Palestine Authority would have to be probably changing dramatically as well in order for there to be a peace agreement. As I said, I'm a deeply committed optimist. I always look on the bright side of everything. But there is enough history around the world in different places, including Tunisia, but also South Africa, even Ireland, Latin America, where you can see that big change can happen and peace can and will come.
Thank you so much, Dan Smith.
Thank you.
This was, you made a brilliant presentation, and you've really gone public now to Swedes.
Thank you. That was the point. And thank you, Bitte, for your part in it. Thank you very much as well.